Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
Hell's Angel's son was born deaf. Until the maid pulled out something terrifying. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the concrete floor of Greg's garage, where the burly Hell's Angel hunched over his prized Harley-Davidson. His weathered hands, covered in grease and calluses, worked methodically on the chrome engine. The tattoos on his arms seemed to dance as his muscles flexed with each turn of the wrench. Charlie stood in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted against the golden light. His bright eyes followed every movement his father made, drinking in the details of the mechanical work. Though he couldn't hear the metallic clinks and clanks of tools against metal, or the occasional grunt from his father, Charlie's other senses were sharp. He could feel the vibrations when Greg tested the engine, see the care in his father's precise movements, and smell the familiar mix of oil and metal that meant home. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Greg glanced up, catching his son's intense gaze. Charlie's hands moved in careful signs, asking about the spark plugs his father was replacing. Greg paused, his thick fingers fumbling through the basic sign language he knew. It wasn't much, nowhere near enough to have the kind of conversation he yearned to have with his boy. But it was something. Old ones. No good. Greg signed slowly, his forehead creasing with concentration. He held up the worn spark plug, letting Charlie examine it closely. Charlie's face lit up with understanding. He moved closer, pointing to different parts of the motorcycle with curiosity burning in his eyes. His hands flew in a flurry of questions that Greg couldn't follow, and the big man's shoulders slumped slightly. The language barrier between them felt like a wall sometimes, thick and impenetrable. Greg turned back to his work, his movements more rigid now. The setting sun caught the silver in his beard, making it glint like chrome. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tightened the last bolt, his mind heavy with thoughts of all the things he couldn't share with his son. The rumble of a well-tuned engine, the roar of wind while riding, the thunder of multiple bikes rolling down the highway together. Charlie watched intently as his father worked, occasionally touching the warm metal of the bike, feeling its subtle vibrations. He seemed to understand something that Greg himself struggled with, that communication went beyond words or sounds. The boy's presence was like a gentle reminder of this, patient and accepting despite the silence between them. After finishing with the spark plugs, Greg straightened up, his back protesting the movement. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of grease across his brow. Charlie moved then, reaching into his back pocket and pulling out a carefully folded piece of paper. The boy smoothed it out against his leg before holding it up proudly. It was a crayon drawing, clearly done with great care. Two figures stood side by side, one large with a big beard and tattoos, the other small but happy. They were both working on a motorcycle together, surrounded by tools and what looked like floating hearts. Greg's throat tightened as he took the drawing. His rough fingers traced the childish lines, feeling the texture of the waxy crayon. Charlie beamed up at him, and Greg couldn't help but smile back, reaching out to ruffle his son's hair affectionately. But even as warmth spread through his chest at this simple gesture of love, Greg felt the familiar ache of guilt and helplessness. The drawing showed them working together, communicating perfectly, sharing their love of motorcycles. The reality was more complicated, filled with misunderstandings and frustrated attempts at connection. Charlie's deafness stood between them like an invisible wall, and despite all his strength and tough guy reputation, Greg had no idea how to break through it. Greg leaned against the kitchen counter, his coffee going cold in his hands, as he watched Charlie through the window. The boy sat alone on the backyard swing set, idly pushing himself back and forth with his feet. A group of neighborhood kids played basketball just over the fence, their shouts and laughter carrying across the yard. Charlie's gaze followed their movements, but he made no attempt to join them. The sight made Greg's chest tighten. He'd seen that same scene play out too many times, his son always on the outside looking in. A couple of the kids glanced Charlie's way, but quickly returned to their game. They'd tried including him before, but the communication barrier always proved too difficult. Greg's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. Lisa's name flashed across the screen, and he let out a heavy sigh before answering. "Yeah?" His voice came out gruffer than intended. "Greg, I just wanted to remind you that Charlie's birthday is next weekend." Lisa's familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "I've got something special coming for him in the mail." Greg rubbed his beard, watching Charlie draw patterns in the dirt with his shoe. "Right, the big 9. Have you planned anything?" The hint of criticism in her tone wasn't lost on him. "Course I have," he lied, guilt gnawing at his insides. Truth was, he'd been so caught up in work and the club that it had slipped his mind completely. "Greg," Lisa started, but he cut her off. "I got it handled, Lisa. You don't need to worry about it." Through the window, Greg noticed Charlie had stopped swinging. A basketball had rolled into their yard, and one of the neighborhood kids was gesturing at Charlie, clearly asking for it back. Charlie picked up the ball, a hopeful look crossing his face, but when the other boy started speaking, that familiar lost expression returned. Charlie's shoulders slumped as he tossed the ball back over the fence. "I gotta go," Greg muttered into the phone, ending the call before Lisa could respond. The sound of the front door opening drew his attention. Emma walked in, still wearing her blue nurse's scrubs from her day job. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and despite working a long shift, she looked fresh and alert. She set her purse down and immediately noticed Charlie through the window. Without hesitation, Emma stepped out into the backyard. Greg watched as she approached Charlie, her hands moving in fluid motions that seemed as natural as breathing to her. Charlie's face lit up at her presence, his own hands flying in response. Greg couldn't understand their silent conversation, but he could see the change in his son. The defeated posture disappeared, replaced by animated gestures and bright smiles. Emma sat next to Charlie on the swing, her hands never stopping their graceful dance as they talked. Standing there in his kitchen, Greg saw Emma differently for the first time. She wasn't just the reliable maid who kept their house in order. She was a bridge to Charlie's world, someone who could reach across the silence and connect with his son in a way that Greg couldn't. Her gentle presence seemed to fill a gap he hadn't even known was there, making their house feel more like a home. Charlie's laughter, a sound that always surprised Greg with its clarity despite his son never having heard it himself, drifted through the window. Emma was grinning too, her hands telling some story that had Charlie completely captivated. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Greg nursed his second cup of coffee. The bitter taste matched his mood as he watched Emma help Charlie pack his backpack for school. Her hands moved with practiced grace, signing questions about homework and lunch preferences. Charlie's face lit up as he responded, his small hands moving quickly if not as smoothly as Emma's. Greg couldn't follow their conversation, but he caught the general meaning from Charlie's expressions and Emma's occasional spoken words. "Did you finish your math worksheet?" Emma asked aloud while signing. Charlie nodded enthusiastically, pulling a folder from his backpack to show her. Emma praised him with both words and gestures, and Greg felt that familiar twist in his gut, a mixture of gratitude and envy that made his coffee taste even more bitter. Emma wore a simple blue sweater and jeans, her blonde hair pulled back in its usual neat ponytail, She moved through their morning routine with an ease that Greg envied, knowing exactly how to communicate with Charlie, how to make him smile, how to be there for him in ways Greg couldn't. "Ready for breakfast, Charlie?" Emma signed and spoke. Charlie nodded and climbed onto a kitchen stool next to his father. Greg reached out and ruffled his son's hair, earning a bright smile that eased some of the tension in his chest. Emma placed a bowl of cereal in front of Charlie, then turned to Greg. "Would you like more coffee?" "Nah, I'm good," Greg replied, his voice gruff. He watched as she moved around their kitchen with familiar comfort, wondering not for the first time about her past. How did someone so young become so skilled with sign language? Why had she chosen to work as their housekeeper when she clearly had other talents? The drive to school was quiet, as it always was. Charlie sat in the back seat, looking out the window while Emma rode shotgun. Greg's custom Harley would have been faster, but it wasn't practical for school runs. His truck rumbled through the morning traffic, its worn leather seats carrying the lingering scent of motor oil and leather conditioning. As they pulled up to the school, Greg noticed a group of kids pointing and laughing near the entrance. His hands tightened on the steering wheel when he realized they were imitating sign language in exaggerated, mocking gestures. Charlie noticed too. His face fell as he watched through the window. Greg's jaw clenched. The urge to storm over there and teach those kids a lesson burned in his chest. He could feel his tattoos stretching as his muscles tensed, ready for confrontation. The old familiar anger rose up, dark and comforting. "Greg!" Emma's voice was soft but firm. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch surprising enough to make him look at her. "That won't help, Charlie." He wanted to argue, wanted to explain that somebody needed to protect his boy, but Emma's eyes held understanding mixed with determination. "His world is different from ours," she continued quietly. "He needs to learn to navigate it his own way. We have to be patient." Greg forced himself to take a deep breath, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Charlie gathered his backpack, seemingly oblivious to the adult's tension. Emma helped him out of the car, her hands moving in encouragement as she signed goodbye. Watching his son walk toward the school entrance, Greg had never felt more useless. The kids had stopped their mocking, but their laughter still echoed in his ears. He bit his tongue until he tasted copper, fighting back the protective rage that threatened to overflow. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room floor as Charlie burst through the front door. His backpack hit the ground with an unusual force, and his shoulders slumped in a way that immediately caught Emma's attention. She set down the dish towel she'd been holding and moved toward him, her hands already forming gentle questions. Greg stood in the kitchen doorway, watching as his son's fingers fumbled through signs, too fast and jumbled to make sense. Tears welled up in Charlie's eyes as he struggled to express himself, his hands shaking with emotion. Emma knelt before him, her own hands steady and patient as she helped him slow down. "What happened, sweetheart?" she asked while signing. Charlie's response was a mix of incomplete gestures and frustrated movements. Greg shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling like an intruder in this moment between his son and Emma. The leather of Greg's jacket creaked as he crossed his arms, desperate to help but not knowing how. His fingers itched to do something, anything, to comfort his boy. But the language barrier between them felt as solid as a brick wall. Emma managed to calm Charlie enough to understand that something had happened during lunch period. As she signed back and forth with him, Greg caught fragments of the conversation through her spoken words. "Made fun of, couldn't hear, dropped tray." Charlie's face crumpled, and before Greg could move, Emma had already pulled him into a hug. The boy buried his face in her shoulder, his small frame shaking with silent sobs. Greg's throat tightened as he watched, feeling simultaneously grateful for Emma's presence and ashamed of his own inadequacy. "I'll make him some hot chocolate," Greg said gruffly, needing to do something useful. Emma nodded without looking up, her hands still moving in comforting patterns against Charlie's back. In the kitchen, Greg slammed cupboard doors harder than necessary as he searched for the cocoa mix. The familiar anger bubbled up inside him. Anger at the kids who'd hurt his son, at himself for not knowing how to help, at the world for making Charlie's life so difficult. When he returned with the hot chocolate, Charlie had calmed down enough to sit on the couch. Emma sat beside him, helping him with his homework while simultaneously signing stories that made him smile despite his tears. Greg set the mug down on the coffee table and retreated to his garage, where at least he understood how things worked. Later that afternoon, Emma moved through the living room, straightening up the usual chaos of an 8-year-old's domain. She picked up scattered toys, arranging them in their proper bins. As she lifted one of Charlie's favorite stuffed animals, a worn teddy bear, something small and metallic fell from inside it. Emma froze, staring at the object on the carpet. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. Her face paled as recognition dawned in her eyes. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at the device in her trembling fingers. After a moment's hesitation, she clutched the device tightly and headed for the garage. Her footsteps were quick but uncertain as she approached the space where Greg spent most of his time. She found him bent over his motorcycle, the radio playing classic rock in the background, completely unaware that his world was about to change. Emma stood in the garage doorway, her hand clutching the small device so tightly her knuckles turned white. The radio's classic rock music filled the space, mixing with the sound of metal tools clicking against the motorcycle's engine. "Greg?" Her voice wavered slightly. "I need to show you something." Greg looked up from his work, wiping his greasy hands on a red shop rag. His eyes narrowed at Emma's serious expression. "What's wrong?" Emma stepped closer, her shoes crunching on the concrete floor. "I found this in Charlie's teddy bear." She held out her palm, revealing a small device that looked like a hearing aid, but was somehow different, sleeker, more advanced. Greg set down his wrench and took the device, turning it over in his calloused hands. "What is this thing?" His voice was gruff, suspicious. "It's a specialized hearing aid," Emma explained, watching his reaction carefully. "It's designed for people like Charlie. It's more advanced than anything currently available." Greg's eyebrows furrowed as he studied the device. "Where'd it come from? Never seen anything like this at the doctor's." He looked up at Emma, his expression hardening. "How long have you known about this?" Emma wrapped her arms around herself, taking a deep breath. I made it." Her words hung in the air between them. "Years ago, before I came here." The radio crackled with static as silence fell between them. Greg's jaw clenched. "You what?" "I used to be a scientist," Emma continued, her words coming faster now. "I specialized in hearing technology. This device, it's something I developed in secret. It can help Charlie hear." Greg set the device down on his workbench with deliberate care. "You've been experimenting on my son?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "No, it's not like that," Emma protested, taking a step forward. "I've been helping him. The device works. It's already working. Haven't you noticed how he's been responding to sounds lately?" Greg's face darkened as realization hit him. "You've been putting this thing in my kid's ears without telling me?" He stood up, his full height towering over Emma. "What gives you the right?" "I only wanted to help," Emma said, her voice trembling. "I've seen how much he struggles, how much you both struggle. This device could change everything for him." "You don't get to make that choice." Greg's fist slammed down on the workbench, making the tools rattle. "You're the maid, not his mother. What if this thing hurts him? What if it makes things worse?" Emma flinched at his words, but stood her ground. "I know what I'm doing. I spent years developing this technology. It's safe." "Safe?" Greg's laugh was harsh. "If it's so safe, Why were you hiding it? Why didn't you tell me about your scientist background when I hired you? Emma's face paled. It's complicated. There are things about my past. Get out, Greg growled, pointing toward the garage door. Just get out. I need to think. Emma hesitated, looking at the device on the workbench. Greg, please! Out! His voice echoed off the garage walls, making the moment feel even more final. Emma backed away, tears gathering in her eyes. She turned and hurried out of the garage, leaving Greg alone with the device that promised to change his son's life, and the anger that came with knowing he'd been kept in the dark about it all. Greg paced the kitchen floor, his heavy boots echoing against the tiles. Emma sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Through the window, they could see Charlie playing in the backyard, blissfully unaware of the tension inside. Start from the beginning, Greg demanded, his voice rough but controlled. And don't leave anything out. Emma took a shaky breath. I found the device in my old research files when I was unpacking. I'd developed it years ago before. She trailed off, then steadied herself. I saw how Charlie struggled every day, how you struggled to connect with him. I thought if I could just help him here, even a little. That wasn't your call to make, Greg cut in, stopping his pacing to face her. He's my son. What if something went wrong? What if it hurt him? I tested it thoroughly before, Emma insisted, looking up at him. I would never put Charlie in danger. You have to believe that. Greg ran a hand through his beard, frustration evident in every movement. How long has he been using it? 2 weeks, Emma admitted. I started with just a few minutes at a time. He cried the first time he heard your motorcycle engine. Her voice softened. He said it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Greg's expression flickered, a mix of emotions crossing his face. He looked out the window at Charlie, who was drawing with chalk on the driveway. Why didn't you just tell me? Emma set down her coffee cup. Because I knew you'd say no. You'd be worried about the risks, about it not being approved by doctors. She met his gaze steadily. And I couldn't bear to see the hope in Charlie's eyes turn to disappointment. Not when I knew I could help. You still should have told me, Greg insisted, but some of the anger had left his voice. I'm his father. I need to know these things. You're right, Emma acknowledged. I was wrong to keep it from you. I got caught up in wanting to help, in seeing him smile when he heard birds singing for the first time. Greg's shoulders sagged slightly. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Has it really helped him that much? Emma nodded. He's been responding to sounds, learning to recognize them. He heard you saying goodnight to him yesterday, even though you thought he couldn't. Greg was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he looked at Emma with a stern expression. If, and I mean if, we continue with this, things need to change. Anything, Emma said quickly. I want to know everything, Greg stated firmly. Every adjustment, every test, every reaction he has. No more secrets, and at the first sign of any problems, we stop immediately. Emma nodded vigorously. Of course, I promise I'll tell you everything from now on. We can work together to help him. Greg's expression softened slightly as he watched Charlie through the window. You really care about him, don't you? More than you know, Emma replied softly. All right, Greg sighed, running a hand over his face. We'll try it your way, but remember what I said. Any problems, and we're done. Thank you, Emma said, relief evident in her voice. You won't regret this, Greg, I promise. Greg stood up, his expression a complex mixture of hope and worry. For Charlie's sake, I hope you're right. The afternoon sun filtered through the living room curtains as Emma carefully placed the small device in Charlie's ear. Her hands trembled slightly, but her movements were precise. Greg stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching every motion with intense focus. Charlie sat perfectly still, his eyes wide with anticipation. He'd been waiting for this moment ever since Emma had explained what the device could do. His small fingers gripped the edge of the couch cushion tightly. "Okay, Charlie," Emma signed, speaking the words at the same time. "I'm going to turn it on now. Remember what we talked about. The sounds might seem strange at first." Greg moved closer, kneeling beside his son. His weathered hands rested on Charlie's shoulders, steadying him. Emma made a final adjustment and pressed a tiny button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Charlie's eyes grew even wider, and his mouth opened in surprise. His head jerked slightly, and he looked around the room frantically. "Charlie?" Greg's voice was soft, uncertain. Charlie's breathing quickened. His hands flew up to his ears, and tears welled up in his eyes. He made a small, distressed sound, the first vocal noise Greg had heard from him in months. "It's okay, buddy," Greg said, though he knew Charlie couldn't understand the words yet. He pulled his son close, feeling the boy's rapid heartbeat. "It's okay." Emma quickly signed, explaining that the sounds were normal, that everything was all right. But Charlie's eyes darted around the room, trying to match the strange new sensations with what he could see. A car horn honked outside, making him jump and burrow deeper into Greg's embrace. "Maybe we should turn it off," Greg suggested, his voice rough with concern. Emma shook her head. "Give him a minute," she signed to both of them. "Charlie, can you look at me?" Charlie peeked out from his father's arms, his cheeks wet with tears. Emma smiled encouragingly and began to tap a simple rhythm on the coffee table. Charlie's eyes widened again, but this time with recognition as he connected the movement he could see with the sound he could hear. Greg watched as his son slowly began to calm down. Charlie's grip on his leather jacket loosened slightly, and his breathing steadied. After a few minutes, Charlie tentatively lifted his head and looked around the room with newfound curiosity. "That's it," Greg murmured, rubbing Charlie's back. "You're doing great, kid." Charlie touched his father's throat, feeling the vibrations as Greg spoke. A small, wondering smile crossed his face, though his eyes still showed uncertainty. He signed something to Emma, who translated for Greg. "He says it's like feeling your voice, but in his ears instead of his hands," she explained. Greg swallowed hard, fighting back his own emotions. He held Charlie close, their foreheads touching, sharing this quiet moment of connection. But beneath his exterior calm, worry gnawed at him. What if this miracle wasn't permanent? What if it somehow hurt Charlie in ways they couldn't predict? When Greg looked up, he caught sight of Emma standing by the window. She had stepped back, giving father and son their moment. But her expression was distant, haunted. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and she stared unseeing at the street outside, lost in memories Greg could only guess at. Charlie tugged at Greg's jacket, drawing his attention back. His son's face showed a mix of fear and wonder, perfectly mirroring Greg's own complicated emotions about this new chapter in their lives. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Greg made breakfast. He deliberately clinked the plates and silverware, watching Charlie's reactions. Each new sound made his son's eyes light up with wonder. "Pancakes," Greg said clearly, holding up the plate. He repeated the word, pointing to his mouth to show Charlie how his lips moved. Emma sat nearby, signing the word at the same time. Charlie mimicked the word silently, his hands moving in the familiar sign while he studied his father's face. Greg's heart swelled with pride as Charlie pointed to the plate and attempted to say "pancakes" out loud. The word wasn't perfect, but it was the first time Greg had heard his son try to speak. That's it, buddy. Greg's voice cracked with emotion. He ruffled Charlie's hair, and his son beamed at the praise. Emma showed Charlie how to listen for the sizzle of the butter in the pan, the scrape of the spatula. She guided his hand to feel the vibrations in Greg's chest when he spoke, helping him connect the physical sensations he knew with the new sounds he was hearing. "Watch this," Greg said, reaching for his coffee mug. He tapped it with a spoon, creating a clear ringing sound. Charlie's eyes widened, and he grabbed his own glass, copying the movement. Soon, they were creating a simple rhythm together, Charlie giggling at the musical sounds they made. Later that morning, they stood outside Charlie's school. Greg knelt down, adjusting the device in Charlie's ear one last time, just as Emma had shown him. His large, calloused hands were gentle as they worked with the tiny mechanism. "Remember what we practiced," Greg said, signing along with his words. His movements were clumsy compared to Emma's fluid gestures, but Charlie understood. "If it gets too loud or scary, you can turn it down like this." He demonstrated the adjustment. Charlie nodded, his backpack clutched tight against his chest. A group of kids ran past, their shouts making him startle slightly. But instead of shrinking away as he usually did, Charlie turned to watch them with interest. "Hey, Charlie," one of his classmates called out, waving. For the first time, Charlie heard his name being called. His face lit up with joy as he waved back. Greg watched as his son walked into the school, standing straighter than usual. Through the window, he could see Charlie's teacher greeting him warmly. Charlie pointed to his ear, and the teacher's face broke into a delighted smile. Other students gathered around Charlie, curious about the device. Instead of the usual teasing, they seemed impressed. One boy even gave Charlie a high five. Greg's chest tightened as he watched his son fit in with his peers for the first time. Standing there in his worn leather jacket, Greg felt tears prick at his eyes. He quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. His son was finally getting a chance to experience the world like other kids. But beneath his joy, a nagging worry persisted about the device's safety. Emma's warnings about potential risks echoed in his mind. For now, though, Greg pushed those concerns aside. Through the classroom window, he could see Charlie sitting at his desk, smiling and alert, ready to experience his first full day of school with the ability to hear. His son looked happy, and for this moment, that was enough. Emma was cleaning the kitchen counter when her phone buzzed. The unknown number made her pause, but she answered anyway. "Hello, is this Emma Winters?" a formal voice asked. "Yes, speaking." Emma's hand tightened around the phone. "This is David Morton from Morton & Associates law firm. I'm calling regarding your previous work at Tech Sound Industries, specifically your research on neural hearing devices." The color drained from Emma's face. She glanced toward the garage where Greg was working on his motorcycle with Charlie. Quickly, she stepped into the pantry and closed the door. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ms. Winters, we have documents showing you were the lead researcher on Project Echo. Several patents were filed under your name." Emma's hands began to shake. "That was a long time ago. I don't work in that field anymore." "Our client is very interested in discussing—" "I'm sorry, I have to go." Emma hung up, her heart pounding. She leaned against the pantry shelf, taking deep breaths to steady herself. When she emerged, Greg was standing in the kitchen doorway. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Wrong number," Emma said, forcing a smile. She busied herself with dinner preparations, but her movements were jerky and distracted. Throughout dinner, Charlie happily showed off his improving speech while Greg praised each attempt. Emma tried to participate, but her mind kept drifting to the phone call. After Charlie went to bed, she started washing dishes, hoping the routine task would calm her nerves. Greg lingered in the kitchen, watching her. "You've been quiet all evening." Emma kept scrubbing a pot that was already clean. "Just tired." "Emma?" Greg's voice was gentle but firm. "I saw you hide in the pantry during that phone call. What's going on?" She put down the pot and gripped the edge of the sink. "It's complicated. Try me." Greg pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, his large frame making the wooden chair seem small. Emma dried her hands slowly, buying time. Finally, she sat across from him. "I used to be someone else," she began. "Dr. Emma Winters, lead researcher at Tech Sound Industries. I developed hearing devices, trying to help people like Charlie." Greg leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "What happened?" "I had a son," Emma said quietly. "He was born deaf. I was young, alone, and scared. I gave him up for adoption." She twisted a dish towel in her hands. "After that, I threw myself into my research. I was determined to find a way to help children like him." "The device you gave Charlie was my design, yes. But there were complications. I met someone, a man who promised to help fund my research." Emma's voice wavered. "He had connections, money. I didn't ask enough questions about where it came from." Greg's expression darkened. "What kind of man?" "The kind who makes problems disappear." Emma stared at her hands. "When I realized what he was really involved in, I tried to back out. But by then, it was too late. The technology I developed was being used for things I never intended." "So you ran?" Emma nodded. "Changed my name, left my career behind, started over as a housekeeper and speech therapist." She met Greg's eyes. "I never thought I'd find another child like Charlie. When I saw him struggling, I couldn't help myself. I had to try." Greg couldn't sleep that night. Emma's words kept echoing in his mind as he tossed and turned in his bed. The morning sun found him sitting at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold, waiting for Emma to come downstairs. When she finally appeared, her usual cheerful morning greeting died on her lips when she saw his expression. "We need to talk more," Greg said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "About that man you mentioned." Emma's hands trembled as she poured herself coffee. "I told you everything that matters." "No, you didn't." Greg pushed back his chair and stood up. At his full height, he towered over her. "You're hiding something about my father, aren't you?" The coffee cup slipped from Emma's grip, clattering against the counter but not breaking. Coffee splashed across the pristine surface. "How did you—" She grabbed a dishcloth, her movements frantic as she wiped up the spill. "The way you hesitated when you mentioned him, the look in your eyes." Greg crossed his arms. "I may not be a scientist like you, but I'm not stupid." Emma stopped cleaning and gripped the counter's edge. "Your father, James, was a complicated man." "James?" Greg's voice grew harder. "You knew him well enough to call him by his first name?" "It was a long time ago," Emma whispered. "Before Charlie, before everything." "Tell me the truth." Greg's words came out as a growl. "What exactly was he to you?" Emma turned to face him, her eyes glistening. "He was my partner at first, both in research and other things. He provided funding through his connections, helped me set up my lab." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I didn't know he was married at first. When I found out, I tried to end things, but by then..." "By then what?" "By then I was already in too deep. The money wasn't just from business deals. Greg, your father was involved with people who..." She shook her head. "I can't talk about it." Greg slammed his hand on the counter, making Emma jump. "You worked with him? All this time you've been in my house, taking care of my son, and you never thought to mention this?" "I didn't know you were his son at first," Emma protested. When I realized, I was afraid you'd react exactly like this. Greg stormed into the living room, Emma following behind him. He yanked open drawers, pulling out old photos he'd never bothered to look through before. "Greg, please," Emma begged. "What are you doing?" He ignored her, rifling through the papers until he found what he was looking for. His hands shook as he held up an old photograph. In it, a younger Emma stood next to a tall man with Greg's same dark eyes and strong jaw. They were smiling, standing in front of what looked like a research facility. "When was this taken?" Greg's voice was deadly quiet. 8 years ago, Emma whispered. "Right before everything fell apart." Greg stared at the photo, his knuckles white where he gripped it. The man who had abandoned his family, who had left Greg to grow up angry and alone, stood there grinning with his arm around Emma. "Greg," Emma stepped forward, reaching for him. "Please don't let this change things. I'm not that person anymore. What I feel for Charlie, how I've tried to help, that's real." But Greg could only see betrayal in those eyes that had once seemed so trustworthy. He backed away from her outstretched hand, the photograph crumpling in his fist. Charlie sat at the breakfast table, his hands pressed against his ears. His face scrunched up in pain, and tears rolled down his cheeks. The sight made Greg's heart twist into knots. "What's happening to him?" Greg demanded, his voice rising with panic. He knelt beside Charlie's chair, trying to comfort his son. But Charlie only whimpered and pulled away. Emma rushed over, her face pale with concern. She gently reached for the device in Charlie's ear, but he jerked away from her touch. "Charlie, sweetheart, please let me look." Greg watched helplessly as Charlie finally allowed Emma to remove the device. The boy's shoulders slumped with relief once it was out, but his eyes remained squeezed shut. "Talk to me, Emma," Greg said, his words coming out rough and desperate. "What's happening to my son?" Emma examined the device with trembling hands. "The neural interface. It's too sophisticated for his developing auditory system." She looked up at Greg, her eyes filled with guilt. "His body is rejecting it. The pain he's feeling, it's a warning sign." Greg's fear turned to anger in an instant. "Warning sign? You mean this thing could hurt him?" He snatched the device from her hands. "You put this in my son's ears without knowing if it was safe?" "I tested it extensively in the lab," Emma protested, but her voice wavered. "But children's neural pathways are different, more delicate. I hoped." "You hoped?" Greg's voice boomed through the kitchen. Charlie flinched at the vibrations he could feel, even without the device. Greg immediately lowered his voice, but the anger remained. "You experimented on my son because you hoped it would work?" Emma's face crumpled. "I wanted to help him. After what happened with my own son, I couldn't bear to see another child struggle." She reached for Charlie, but Greg stepped between them. "Don't touch him," Greg growled. "You've done enough damage." Charlie looked between them, confusion and fear written across his face. He reached for the device in Greg's hand, but Greg shook his head. "No more," Greg signed, his movements sharp with emotion. "The device is dangerous. We can't use it anymore." Charlie's eyes widened in panic. He grabbed for the device again, but Greg held it out of reach. The boy's face reddened, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. "Charlie, please understand," Emma signed, her movements gentle. "It's hurting you." Charlie shook his head violently. His hands flew in angry gestures. "Want to hear? Want to be normal?" "You are normal," Greg signed, his heart breaking. "You're perfect just as you are." But Charlie wasn't listening anymore. He stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward, his face contorted with rage and despair, and he let out a raw, guttural scream that echoed through the house. The sound, coming from someone who had never heard his own voice, was primal and devastating. Charlie's scream continued as he slammed his hands against the table, tears streaming down his face. His world of brief sound was being taken away, and he couldn't understand why. Greg reached for him, but Charlie ducked away, running from the kitchen in a storm of confusion and hurt. The silence that followed his departure was deafening. Greg stood frozen, the device still clutched in his hand, as the echo of his son's pain-filled cry rang in his ears. Greg sat in his darkened living room, surrounded by stacks of medical journals and printouts from hearing specialists. The soft glow of his laptop illuminated his tired face as he scrolled through yet another article about cochlear implants. Empty coffee cups littered the coffee table, evidence of his sleepless nights. Down the hall, he could hear Charlie's quiet movements as the boy got ready for bed. The past few days had been tough on all of them. Charlie had retreated into himself, barely acknowledging either Greg or Emma. "Any luck?" Emma's voice was soft as she appeared in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. Greg rubbed his eyes. "Nothing promising. Everything's either experimental or—" He gestured at the screen. "Way out of our reach." Emma nodded, staying in the doorway as if afraid to come closer. The usual warmth in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a haunted look that seemed to grow deeper each day. She hadn't been eating much, and Greg noticed she'd stopped wearing her usual cheerful colors, sticking to dark, muted tones instead. "I've made some calls to my old colleagues," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But after what happened with the device—" She trailed off, looking down at her feet. Greg watched her for a moment. The anger he'd felt toward her had gradually softened into something more complicated. She'd made a mistake, yes, but he understood now that it came from a place of love for Charlie. "I spoke with Dr. Patterson today," Greg said, closing his laptop. "He said Charlie's hearing pathways weren't damaged permanently. We got lucky." Emma's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank God," she breathed. Greg stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. Through Charlie's partially open door, he could see his son sitting on his bed, flipping through a picture book. The sight of Charlie, safe and whole, sparked something in Greg's mind. "You know what?" Greg said, more to himself than Emma. "Maybe we've been looking at this all wrong." Emma stepped into the room, curiosity replacing some of the guilt in her expression. "What do you mean?" "We've been so focused on fixing Charlie's hearing that we forgot something important." Greg walked to Charlie's doorway, watching his son. "He doesn't need fixing. He needs understanding." "But the world isn't always kind to those who are different," Emma said softly. "Then we'll teach him to be stronger than the world's unkindness," Greg replied. He turned to Emma. "Will you help me learn proper sign language? Not just the basics, but everything?" For the first time in days, a small smile touched Emma's lips. "Of course." Greg walked into Charlie's room and sat on the edge of his bed. Charlie looked up, his eyes still holding traces of hurt and confusion from the past few days. Greg reached for Charlie's hand and spelled out, "I love you," in the simple sign language he knew. Charlie's eyes widened slightly. He corrected his father's finger placement, then signed it back perfectly. Greg smiled and pulled his son into a hug, feeling Charlie's small arms wrap tightly around his neck. From the doorway, Emma watched the scene unfold, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't move to join them, but her presence was a quiet support, a promise of help for the journey ahead. The kitchen was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional clink of Emma's spoon against her untouched coffee cup. Greg sat across from her at the small kitchen table, watching as she traced invisible patterns on the wooden surface with her fingertip. "I thought I could make everything right," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The device, it wasn't just about helping Charlie. I guess I was trying to prove something to myself. Greg leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The morning sun streaming through the window caught the silver in his beard. Prove what? Emma's hand stilled on the table. That I could fix things. That I wasn't a failure. She looked up, her blue eyes clouded with pain. When I gave up my son, I promised myself I'd never let another child suffer if I could help it. But everything I touch seems to... She gestured helplessly. You were trying to help, Greg said, his gruff voice softening. Charlie knows that. I know that too. Do you? Emma's laugh was hollow. I keep thinking about how I could have hurt him permanently, all because I was so desperate to prove I could make a difference. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking its warmth. My whole life, I've been running from my mistakes. The failed experiments, my son, your father. Greg tensed slightly at the mention of his father, but kept his expression neutral. We all carry stuff we're not proud of. But most people's mistakes don't risk hurting an innocent child, Emma countered, her voice cracking. I was so focused on being the hero, on finding a miracle solution, that I couldn't see how my own fears were driving everything. I wanted to fix Charlie's hearing because... She paused, swallowing hard. Because I couldn't fix my own life. The kitchen fell silent again. Outside, birds chirped in the maple tree, and somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Greg reached across the table, his tattooed hand covering Emma's trembling ones. Listen, he said. We don't need miracles. Charlie doesn't need fixing. What he needs, what we all need, is to stop running from who we are. Emma's eyes filled with tears. How can you be so understanding, after everything I've done? Because I see someone who cares enough about my son to risk everything to help him, Greg replied. That counts for something in my book. I don't know how to move forward from here, Emma admitted, a tear sliding down her cheek. I don't know how to help without trying to fix everything. Then we'll figure it out together, Greg said firmly. No more miracle devices, no more quick fixes. Just us, helping Charlie navigate his world the best way we can. Emma nodded, relief washing over her face even as more tears fell. She squeezed Greg's hand, wordless gratitude in the gesture. The weight of her past mistakes still pressed heavily on her shoulders, but for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. Greg watched her, understanding in his eyes. They sat there in the morning light, their coffee growing cold, sharing a moment of quiet acceptance. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least they wouldn't have to walk it alone. The living room floor was scattered with flashcards, each showing a different sign. Greg sat cross-legged on the carpet, his leather vest draped over the couch behind him. Charlie mirrored his position, eyes bright with concentration, as Greg attempted to form the sign for motorcycle. His large hands, more used to gripping handlebars and wrenches, fumbled with the delicate movements. Charlie giggled silently at his father's awkward attempts, then demonstrated the correct way, his small fingers flowing through the motion with natural grace. Like this? Greg tried again, his weathered face scrunched in concentration. Charlie nodded enthusiastically, clapping his hands. The pride in his son's eyes made Greg's chest tighten with emotion. Emma watched from the kitchen doorway, a small smile playing on her lips as she witnessed their practice session. She had offered to help, but Greg had insisted on learning alongside Charlie, wanting to share in his son's journey rather than just observe it. They moved on to other words. Family, friend, love. Greg struggled with some of the more complex signs, but Charlie's patience never wavered. When Greg successfully signed father, Charlie's face lit up with such joy that Greg had to look away for a moment, overwhelmed. Charlie tapped his father's arm to get his attention, then pointed to a new flashcard. It showed the sign for story. Greg nodded, remembering how they used to struggle at bedtime when Charlie wanted to hear about his father's adventures on the road. Now, using their growing vocabulary of signs, Greg could share these tales in a way Charlie could truly understand. As Greg began signing about a cross-country ride he'd taken years ago, his movements became more confident. He described the wide-open roads and the feeling of freedom, incorporating gestures that went beyond the basic signs they'd learned. Charlie leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story, his eyes dancing with excitement. When Greg finished, Charlie jumped up and rushed to his room. He returned moments later with his sketchbook, flipping to a new page. With quick, sure strokes, he drew a picture of two figures on a motorcycle, one large and one small, racing across an endless highway. Greg's throat tightened as he watched his son draw. Charlie had always used art to bridge the gap between their worlds, but now they had something more, something they shared equally. Charlie set down his pencil and looked up at his father. His hands moved slowly, deliberately forming each sign they'd practiced. First, father, then motorcycle, and finally, with careful precision, love. The simple sequence of gestures hit Greg like a physical force. This wasn't just Charlie copying signs from flashcards. This was his son telling him, in his own way, that he loved their time together, loved learning with him, loved him. Greg's hands shook slightly as he signed back, love and son, the movements coming naturally now, straight from his heart. Charlie threw himself into his father's arms, hugging him tightly. Greg held his son close, realizing that all the fancy technology in the world couldn't compare to this moment of pure connection. Emma quietly stepped away from the doorway, leaving father and son to their newfound language of love. Greg and Charlie remained on the floor among the scattered flashcards, their hearts speaking volumes without a single sound. Through these simple signs, they had found their voice together. Greg finally understood that helping Charlie didn't mean fixing him. It meant meeting him in his world and learning to speak his language. In that moment, surrounded by flashcards and holding his son, Greg felt more fluent in love than he ever had before. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting warm patches of light across the worn wooden table. Emma sat alone, her trembling hands holding a crisp white envelope. The adoption agency's logo stood out starkly in the corner, making her heart race. She carefully opened the letter, her eyes scanning the words as tears began to well up. The paper shook in her hands, and she didn't notice Greg entering the kitchen, his heavy boots surprisingly quiet on the linoleum floor. "Emma?" Greg's gruff voice was softer than usual. "You okay?" Emma quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but it was too late to hide her distress. The letter lay open on the table between them, its official letterhead seeming to mock her composure. "It's from the adoption agency," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They found some information about my son." Greg pulled out a chair and sat down, his large frame making the old wooden seat creak. His leather vest creaked too as he leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. He waited patiently, giving her space to continue. "He's been trying to find me," Emma managed, her voice cracking. "He's 18 now, old enough to—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Greg nodded slowly, understanding filling his eyes. He'd seen that same longing for connection in Charlie's face countless times. "What are you thinking?" Emma's fingers traced the edges of the paper, following the creases she'd already made from folding and unfolding it repeatedly. "I've spent so long running from my past, Greg. From everything that happened with your father, from the scandal at the research facility, from—" She gestured helplessly at the letter. "From this." The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background, marking the heavy silence between them. Through the window they could see Charlie in the backyard, drawing in his sketchbook under the old oak tree. "I was so young when I had him," Emma continued, her voice stronger now. "Barely more than a kid myself. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving him a chance at a better life. But I've carried this weight ever since." Greg reached across the table, his tattooed hand covering hers gently. "We all got things we're running from, Emma, but sometimes you gotta turn around and face them." She looked up at him, seeing the understanding in his eyes. This man, who had faced his own fears about being a father to Charlie, who was learning to communicate in a whole new way. He knew something about courage. "I think—" Emma took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I think it's time I stopped running. I need to find him, Greg. I need to explain, to try to make things right." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Even if he hates me, even if he never wants to see me again after that, I owe him the truth." Greg squeezed her hand. "Then that's what you gotta do." Emma nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. But these were different. Tears of determination rather than despair. "I'm going to find him. I'm going to tell him everything, about the research, about his father, about why I had to leave. He deserves to know his story." "You don't have to do it alone," Greg said quietly, his usual gruffness softened by compassion. "Thank you," Emma whispered, managing a small smile. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket. The weight of it felt different now, like a key rather than a burden. The morning breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean across the empty beach. Greg sat on a weathered blanket, his leather vest traded for a simple black t-shirt that revealed his colorful tattoos. Beside him, Charlie built an elaborate sand castle, his small hands carefully patting each tower into shape. Emma walked along the water's edge, her blonde hair whipping in the wind as she collected seashells. She'd been quiet all morning, lost in thought, but there was a peaceful look on her face that Greg hadn't seen before. Charlie tugged on Greg's sleeve and pointed to his castle, signing excitedly. Greg smiled, recognizing the words they'd been practicing together. "That's amazing, buddy," he signed back, his movement still a bit clumsy but growing more confident each day. Emma returned with her handful of shells, setting them down carefully next to Charlie's castle. She showed him how to decorate the walls with them, their hands working together in comfortable silence. Greg watched them, remembering how far they'd come from those first difficult days. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the sand beneath them. Charlie ran to the water's edge, splashing in the shallow waves. Greg kept a watchful eye on him while Emma arranged their picnic lunch. "He looks so happy," Emma said softly, spreading out sandwiches on paper plates. "It's nice to see him just being a kid." Greg nodded, watching his son jump over the incoming waves. "Yeah, it is." He turned to Emma. "You seem different today, more settled." Emma smiled, her eyes on the horizon. "I am. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing the right thing. Not running, not hiding, just facing what needs to be faced." Charlie came running back, sand-covered and grinning. He grabbed a sandwich and settled between them, his wet feet leaving marks on the blanket. They ate together, sharing chips and laughing at the seagulls that swooped hopefully overhead. After lunch, Greg taught Charlie how to skip stones across the water. Emma watched them from the blanket, her camera capturing moments she knew she'd want to remember. Greg's patient hands showing Charlie how to hold the stone, Charlie's triumphant grin when he finally got one to skip, the way they high-fived afterward. As the afternoon wore on, Charlie grew tired from all the swimming and playing. He curled up on the blanket, his head resting on Greg's leg, and dozed off to the rhythm of the waves. "I've made my arrangements," Emma said quietly, careful not to wake Charlie. "The adoption agency gave me an address in Portland. I'm leaving tomorrow morning." Greg looked at her, seeing both determination and fear in her eyes. "You sure you're ready?" Emma nodded, running her fingers through the sand. "As ready as I'll ever be. These past months with you and Charlie, they've taught me something important. Sometimes the hardest path is the right one." The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. They packed up their things, Greg carrying a sleepy Charlie to the car while Emma folded the blanket and gathered their belongings. At the car, Emma paused, taking one last look at the beach. The waves continued their endless dance with the shore, unchanged by the decisions being made on their edges. She touched the letter in her pocket, feeling its weight, not as a burden anymore, but as a promise of something new. Charlie stirred in Greg's arms, signing a sleepy "thank you" to Emma. She smiled, signing back "sweet dreams" before climbing into the car. The drive home was quiet, filled with the kind of comfortable silence that comes from knowing exactly where you need to go next. Greg was tinkering with his motorcycle in the garage when his phone buzzed. Charlie sat nearby on an old milk crate, carefully organizing Greg's tools by size and color, something that had become their Saturday morning routine. "Emma?" Greg answered, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. His voice must have carried some concern because Charlie looked up, his eyes questioning. Through the phone came a shaky breath. "I found him, Greg." Emma's voice cracked with emotion. "My son, he's here in Portland." Greg sat down heavily on his workbench, the wrench in his hand forgotten. "You actually found him? That's great, Emma." He paused, noting something in her tone. "Isn't it?" "I don't know what to do," Emma confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's 17 now, Greg. He has a whole life, a family who raised him. What right do I have to just walk into his world?" Charlie tugged at Greg's sleeve, concern written across his young face. Greg signed that everything was okay, managing a reassuring smile. "Listen," Greg said into the phone, his voice gruff but gentle. "You've spent years carrying this weight. You deserve the chance to at least try." "But what if he hates me?" The fear in Emma's voice was raw. "What if he can't forgive me for giving him up?" Greg watched Charlie return to organizing the tools, his small hands moving with careful precision. "Being a parent isn't about being perfect, Emma. Sometimes it's just about showing up even when you're scared." A long silence followed, broken only by Emma's uneven breathing. "You taught me that," Greg continued, surprising himself with the words. "Watching you with Charlie all these months, you showed me that love isn't about fixing everything. It's about being there, trying your best, even when things are hard." "I'm terrified," Emma admitted. "Good," Greg replied, earning a watery laugh from Emma. "That means you care. That means it matters." Charlie had finished organizing the tools and was now drawing pictures in the dust on Greg's bike tank with his finger. Greg watched him, remembering all the times he'd been terrified too. Terrified of failing his son, of not being enough. "You know what Charlie told me yesterday?" Greg said, signing along out of habit, even though Emma couldn't see him. "He said he was scared of his first swimming lesson, but he wanted to try anyway. Maybe we could learn something from him." Emma's voice grew stronger. "When did you get so wise, Greg Calloway?" "Must be all that time spent with you two," he chuckled. "Look, Emma, whatever happens, you've got us in your corner. Right, Charlie?" Charlie, picking up on his name, looked up and nodded enthusiastically, even though he couldn't hear the conversation. Greg signed Emma to him, and Charlie's face lit up with a bright smile. "See? The kid's got your back," Greg said. "Just take it one step at a time. That's all any of us can do." "Thank you, Greg," Emma said softly, "for everything." After they hung up, Greg sat watching Charlie, who had moved on to carefully polishing Greg's chrome pipes with a clean rag, mimicking what he'd seen his father do countless times. The sight stirred something deep in Greg's chest. Pride mixed with a fierce kind of love that still surprised him sometimes. Just like Emma, he had his own fears to face, his own imperfections to accept. Looking at his son, Greg made a silent promise. He would be there for Charlie, learning and growing alongside him, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Not because he was perfect, but because that's what love demanded. Emma's hands trembled as she stood outside the small coffee shop in downtown Portland. Through the window she could see him. Her son, Marcus, 17 years old now, with sandy blonde hair like hers and a strong jaw that reminded her of his father. He sat alone at a corner table, fidgeting with a paper cup, waiting. Her text message to him had been simple. "I'm your birth mother. Would you like to meet?" His response, equally brief. "Yes. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed open the door. The bell chimed overhead, and Marcus looked up. Their eyes met, and Emma felt her heart skip a beat. She'd imagined this moment countless times, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of seeing her son as a young man. "Marcus?" Her voice wavered as she approached his table. He stood up, taller than she'd expected. "Emma?" His voice was deep, uncertain. They stood there for a moment, awkward and unsure, before Emma gestured to the empty chair. "May I?" Marcus nodded, and they both sat down. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and years of absence. Emma started, then stopped, her carefully prepared speech forgotten. "I don't know where to begin." Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "Why now?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of pain. "After all these years?" Emma's eyes welled with tears. "Because I couldn't bear the weight of not knowing you anymore. Because not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you. Wondered if I made the right choice." "Did you?" Marcus's question was direct, his gaze intense. "I was 19, Emma said softly. "Alone, scared, mixed up with people who—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I couldn't give you the life you deserved. Your adoptive parents, they're good people?" Marcus's expression softened slightly. "They're great. They've always been honest with me about being adopted. They even encouraged me to meet you when I got your message." Emma felt a tear roll down her cheek. "I'm so glad. That's all I ever wanted. For you to have a good life, a safe home." "I used to be angry," Marcus admitted, his fingers tightening around his cup. "I used to think you didn't want me." "Oh, Marcus," Emma's voice broke. "I wanted you more than anything. That's why I had to let you go. I was involved with dangerous people, your father's crowd. I couldn't risk your safety." Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. He was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he reached across the table and took Emma's hand. The gesture, so simple yet profound, made Emma's breath catch. "I forgive you," he said quietly. "I think I understand now. You were trying to protect me." Emma couldn't hold back her tears anymore. "I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." Marcus stood up, still holding her hand, and pulled her into an embrace. Emma wrapped her arms around her son, breathing in the moment she'd dreamed of for 17 years. In his arms, she felt the weight of guilt and regret begin to lift, replaced by something lighter. Hope, perhaps, or the possibility of a new beginning. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me a chance to explain." Marcus hugged her tighter, and in that embrace, Emma found the closure she'd been seeking for so long. Greg sat in the waiting room of Dr. Martinez's office, his large frame looking out of place in the cheerful children's therapy center. Charlie sat beside him, swinging his legs and flipping through a picture book. The walls were painted in soft blues and yellows, with cartoon animals dancing across the borders. "Mr. Calloway," a gentle-voiced woman appeared in the doorway. "We're ready for you and Charlie." Greg nodded, tapping Charlie's shoulder. His son looked up, and Greg signed, "Time to go in," one of the many signs he'd been practicing lately. Charlie's face lit up at his father's effort, and he hopped off the chair. Inside the office, Dr. Martinez sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, patting the space in front of her. Charlie immediately plopped down, but Greg hesitated before lowering his bulky frame to the floor. "Today," Dr. Martinez signed and spoke simultaneously, "we're going to work on expressing our feelings through art." She laid out paper and markers, and Charlie eagerly grabbed a blue one. Greg watched as his son began drawing, his small face scrunched in concentration. "Many deaf children struggle with expressing complex emotions," Dr. Martinez explained quietly to Greg. "Art therapy helps bridge that gap." Greg nodded, his throat tight as he watched Charlie draw what looked like 3 figures: himself, Greg, and Emma. The love and care in those simple stick figures made his heart ache. After the session, they found Emma waiting in the lobby. She'd been spending more time with them since reconnecting with Marcus, as if making peace with her past had freed her to be more present. "How did it go?" she asked, signing for Charlie's benefit. Charlie excitedly showed her his drawing, and Emma's eyes softened at the sight of their little family captured in crayon. Later that evening, after Charlie had gone to bed, Greg and Emma sat on the back porch. The night was cool, and crickets chirped in the darkness. "Marcus wants to come over for dinner next week," Emma said, breaking the comfortable silence. "If that's okay with you and Charlie?" Greg turned to look at her. In the dim porch light, she looked younger, more at peace than he'd ever seen her. "Of course it's okay. Your family." Emma's eyes welled up. "I never thought I'd have this again. A family. After everything that happened with your father, with Marcus. I thought I'd lost my chance." "Life's funny that way," Greg said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Sometimes you find what you need in the last place you'd expect." "I'm ready to move forward," Emma said quietly. "Really move forward. No more running from the past, no more secrets." Greg reached over and squeezed her hand. "You'll always have a place here, Emma. With us. Charlie adores you, and I—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about who sticks around when things get tough." Emma squeezed back, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a second chance, for letting me be part of your lives." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The weight of the past felt lighter somehow, as if forgiveness had cleared the air between them. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but full of possibility, and for once, neither of them felt afraid to face it. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Charlie practiced his latest signs with Greg. His small hands moved with growing confidence, forming words and phrases that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "Want pancakes, please," Charlie signed, each movement deliberate and clear. His face beamed with pride as Greg understood immediately. Greg's chest swelled with emotion. Just 6 months ago, their conversations had been limited to frustrated gestures and misunderstandings. Now, they were having real conversations. He signed back, "Good job, buddy," his large, calloused hands moving with newfound grace. Emma watched from the kitchen counter, smiling as she mixed pancake batter. "His sentence structure is getting so much better," she said, signing simultaneously, a habit they'd all developed. "The therapy sessions are really helping." Charlie tugged at Greg's sleeve and signed, Tell story about motorcycle? His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Greg nodded, settling into what had become their morning routine. As he flipped pancakes, he signed about his latest motorcycle repair, describing the parts and tools with gestures they'd created together. Charlie followed every movement, occasionally asking questions with growing sophistication. Later that afternoon, their small living room filled with the people who mattered most in their lives. Dr. Martinez had come, along with Charlie's favorite teacher from school, Mrs. Chen. Emma's son, Marcus, was there too, still somewhat shy, but warming to his new extended family. The coffee table held a homemade cake decorated with "Way to go, Charlie" in blue frosting. Scattered around were photos showing Charlie's progress over the months, pictures of him at therapy sessions, practicing signs with Greg, and working with his teachers. Charlie proudly showed everyone his communication journal, filled with drawings and newly learned signs. His confidence had grown tremendously. Gone was the frustrated little boy who felt trapped in silence. In his place stood a child who had found his voice in his own unique way. Greg watched as Charlie demonstrated his latest achievement, a complete story about his day at school, told entirely in fluid signs. The boy's face lit up with each successful communication, and the small audience responded with enthusiastic applause and signed appreciation. Emma touched Greg's arm gently. "Look at him," she whispered. "He's flourishing." Greg nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. His son, once so isolated, was now the center of attention, radiating joy and confidence. The tough biker found himself blinking back tears, remembering the days when he'd felt helpless to connect with his own child. Mrs. Chen approached them, her eyes bright. "Charlie's progress is remarkable," she said. "He's becoming a leader in class, helping other students learn basic signs. He's found his place." Charlie ran up to Greg then, his hands flying in excitement as he signed about the cake. Greg knelt down to his level, signing back with equal enthusiasm. The exchange was natural, comfortable, a father and son finding their own language of love. The afternoon light filled the room with a warm glow as their small gathering celebrated not just Charlie's achievements, but the journey they'd all taken together. It was more than just a party. It was a testament to the power of patience, understanding, and unconditional love. Emma started serving the cake, while Marcus helped distribute plates. Charlie sat between Greg and Dr. Martinez, his hands never still as he shared stories and jokes. The room buzzed with a mixture of spoken words and silent conversations, a harmony of two worlds that had finally found their balance. After the celebration wound down and Charlie had fallen asleep on the couch, Greg and Emma found themselves alone in the kitchen. The remnants of the party, paper plates, coffee cups, and cake crumbs, were scattered across the counter. Emma absently wiped down the surfaces while Greg leaned against the refrigerator, his arms crossed. "Quite a day," Greg said softly, mindful of Charlie sleeping in the next room. The setting sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window, painting everything in warm orange hues. Emma nodded, setting down her cleaning cloth. "I never thought we'd get here," she admitted. "Remember when you first found out about the device? You were so angry." Greg's beard twitched with a slight smile. "I was scared," he corrected. "Scared of getting my hopes up, scared of trusting someone else with Charlie's well-being." He paused, studying Emma's face. "Scared of letting someone else in?" Emma pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, her shoulders relaxing. "And now?" "Now." Greg joined her at the table, his large frame making the kitchen chair look small. "Now I'm wondering what's next. For all of us." His weathered hands rested on the table, fingers drumming thoughtfully. "Marcus asked me something interesting yesterday," Emma said, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. He wanted to know if I'd ever consider helping other families like ours. Kids who are deaf, parents who feel lost. Greg's eyes lit up with interest. You mean professionally? Maybe. Emma leaned forward, her voice growing animated. Think about it, Greg. How many other families are out there struggling like we did? Parents who don't know where to start, kids who feel isolated. And you've got the background for it, Greg added, remembering her past as a scientist. Plus everything we've learned with Charlie. Emma nodded eagerly. Your experience too. You know what it's like from a parent's perspective. The fear, the frustration, the breakthroughs. Greg stroked his beard thoughtfully. Could be something, he mused. Lord knows I've got enough contacts through the club. Could spread the word. Maybe find families who need help but don't know where to look. We could start small, Emma suggested. Maybe a support group. Share what we've learned about communication, about patience. She smiled. About not trying to fix everything with experimental devices. Greg chuckled, but his eyes were serious. You know, that's not a bad idea at all. Charlie's doing so well now. Maybe it's time to pay it forward. We could work together, Emma said softly. If you want to, that is. Greg reached across the table and took her hand. His calloused fingers were gentle against her skin. I'd like that, he said. We make a pretty good team, don't we? From the living room came the sound of Charlie stirring. They both turned to look through the doorway, where they could see him curled up under a blanket, peaceful and secure. Think about how different things might have been, Emma murmured, if we'd had someone to guide us from the beginning. Greg squeezed her hand. Then let's be that someone for other families. We've got the experience, we've got the knowledge. And we've got each other, Emma finished. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the possibility of this new chapter in their lives. The kitchen was growing dim as evening settled in, but neither moved to turn on the lights. Sometimes, they'd learned, the best conversations happened in these quiet, in-between moments. Greg stood at the front of Charlie's classroom, his massive frame making the kid-sized chairs look like dollhouse furniture. His leather vest and tattoos drew wide-eyed stares from the students, but their attention was riveted on his gentle voice and careful words. You see, Greg said, gesturing to Charlie, who sat beaming in the front row. Being different isn't something to be ashamed of. It's what makes each of us special. His hands moved along with his words, signing as he spoke, something that had taken months of practice but now came naturally. Ms. Peterson, Charlie's teacher, watched from her desk with an approving smile as Greg continued. Some people might think that because my son can't hear, he's missing out. But Charlie? He turned to his son, whose eyes shone with pride. Charlie sees the world in ways that make me wish I could see it like him too. A little girl with pigtails raised her hand. But how do you talk to each other? Greg's beard twitched with a smile. Well, that's a great question. Charlie and I had to learn together. Sometimes we use sign language. He demonstrated by signing, I love you to Charlie, who signed back immediately. And sometimes, we just understand each other without any words at all. The children watched in fascination as Greg and Charlie carried on a brief conversation in sign language. Some of them tried to copy the movements, giggling when they got them wrong. The thing is, Greg continued, his voice growing serious but remaining warm, everyone faces challenges. Maybe you're not good at math, or reading is hard for you, or maybe you're just having a rough day. What matters is having people who support you and never giving up. A boy in the back raised his hand. Is that why you have all those tattoos? Because you never give up? The class erupted in laughter, and even Greg couldn't help but chuckle. Well, these tattoos tell different stories. But you know what? Each one reminds me that change is possible, that we can always become better versions of ourselves. Charlie stood up then, walking to stand beside his father. Greg placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and the pride radiating between them was palpable. "My son here," Greg said, his voice thick with emotion. "He taught me more about being strong than all my years with the motorcycle club. He showed me that real strength isn't about being tough or scary. It's about having the courage to keep trying, even when things are hard." The children sat in rapt attention as Greg shared more stories about their journey together, learning sign language, finding new ways to communicate, and building a stronger bond than ever before. He talked about Emma's help, about the importance of accepting support from others, and about how sometimes the best families aren't the ones we're born into, but the ones we build. As the presentation drew to a close, Charlie surprised everyone by standing up to sign something to the class. Greg translated, his voice filled with pride. "Charlie says thank you for being his friends, and for learning to understand him better." The class broke into enthusiastic applause, and several students rushed forward to high-five Charlie. Greg watched as his son, once so isolated, was now surrounded by accepting friends who saw him for who he was, not for what he couldn't do. Standing there in that classroom, Greg felt something shift inside him. The tough biker who once thought strength came from intimidation now found himself moved by the simple acceptance of children and the unconditional love of his son. He watched Charlie interact with his classmates, signing and laughing, completely at ease in his own skin. In that moment, observing his son's confidence and joy, Greg felt a deep wave of gratitude wash over him. This wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was more meaningful than anything he could have imagined. Emma's car pulled into the driveway just as the evening sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. She sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, taking deep breaths to steady herself. The past few days with her son had been emotionally draining but healing in ways she never expected. As she stepped out of the car, the front door swung open. Charlie burst out, running toward her with his arms wide open, his face lit up with pure joy as he wrapped his arms around her waist. Emma hugged him back, fighting back tears of happiness. Greg appeared in the doorway, his imposing figure softened by the gentle smile on his face. He walked over to them, his steps measured and calm. "Welcome home," he signed, and spoke simultaneously. Emma looked up at him, touched by the simple gesture. "It's good to be back," she replied, both signing and speaking. The ability to communicate in both ways had become second nature to all of them now. Charlie tugged at her sleeve, his hands flying in excited signs as he told her about his father's visit to his classroom. Emma watched intently, nodding and responding with appropriate expressions. Greg stood nearby, occasionally helping to clarify when Charlie's enthusiasm made his signs too quick to follow. "Why don't we head inside?" Greg suggested. "I actually managed to cook something without burning down the kitchen." Emma raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You cooked? Don't sound so shocked." Greg chuckled, his beard twitching. "Charlie helped, didn't you, buddy?" Charlie nodded enthusiastically, grabbing Emma's hand and pulling her toward the house. The familiar scent of home-cooked food wafted from the kitchen, making Emma realize how hungry she was after the long drive. Inside, the kitchen table was set for 3, with a proper tablecloth and everything. A pot of what looked like spaghetti and meatballs sat in the center, steam still rising from it. Charlie proudly pointed to the garlic bread he'd helped prepare. "This is wonderful," Emma said, taking in the scene. She could feel the tension from her emotional reunion with her son melting away, replaced by the warmth of being with this unlikely family they'd created. Greg pulled out a chair for her, a gesture that seemed both surprising and perfectly natural coming from him. "Charlie insisted on waiting for you before we ate," he explained. "He wanted to make sure you were here for family dinner." The word family hung in the air, carrying weight and meaning that touched Emma deeply. As they settled around the table, Charlie between them, she felt more at peace than she had in years. Her past no longer haunted her the way it used to. Charlie began serving the food, concentrating hard not to spill anything. His face showed such determination that both adults had to suppress their smiles. When he successfully filled all 3 plates, they applauded, making him beam with pride. Greg reached for the garlic bread, accidentally knocking over his water glass. Instead of getting frustrated as he might have once done, he laughed, signing "Clumsy Dad" to Charlie, who giggled in response. Emma grabbed paper towels, and they cleaned up together, the minor accident turning into a moment of shared amusement. As they settled back to their meal, the conversation flowed naturally, a mix of signs and spoken words. Charlie told animated stories about school. Greg shared funny moments from his motorcycle shop. And Emma felt the simple joy of being present in this moment with them. The kitchen was filled with warmth, laughter, and understanding. 3 people who had found each other against all odds, creating something beautiful from their broken pieces. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees lining Main Street as Greg, Emma, and Charlie walked together. Charlie skipped between them, occasionally stopping to point at interesting things he spotted. A colorful bird, a shiny car, or a particularly interesting shop window. His hands moved excitedly as he signed about each discovery. Greg watched his son with pride, remembering how far they'd come. Just months ago, he would have been overwhelmed by Charlie's enthusiasm, unsure how to respond. Now, his own hands moved naturally in response, signing back with growing confidence. Emma walked beside them, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. She'd changed too. The weight of secrets no longer burdened her shoulders. She carried herself with a new lightness, free from the shadows of her past. "Look," Charlie signed suddenly, pointing to a street musician playing guitar. The man sat on a wooden stool, his case open for tips, strumming a melody that floated through the air. Charlie closed his eyes, feeling the vibrations through his feet from the musician's amplifier. He swayed slightly, connecting with the music in his own unique way. Greg placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, sharing the moment. "Music isn't just about hearing," Emma signed, kneeling beside Charlie. "It's about feeling, too." The boy nodded enthusiastically, his face lighting up with understanding. He reached for his father's hand and placed it on the amplifier, wanting to share his experience. Greg felt the steady thrum of the bass notes, seeing the world through his son's perspective. They continued their walk, passing by the local park where children played on the swings and slides. A group of kids Charlie's age waved to him, and he waved back. Some of them had learned basic signs, making an effort to include him in their games. "Want to join them?" Greg signed to Charlie. Charlie looked at the playground, then back at his father and Emma. He shook his head, signing, "I want to stay with you both." Emma's eyes moistened at the simple declaration. She remembered a time when Charlie had felt isolated, trapped between the hearing and deaf worlds. Now he moved between them with growing confidence, choosing his moments with certainty. They stopped at their favorite ice cream shop, ordering 3 different flavors. Charlie got chocolate with sprinkles, making a mess as he ate it. Greg watched as Emma helped clean Charlie's face, her movements natural and maternal. The scene stirred something in his heart, a feeling of completeness he'd never expected to find. Outside the shop, they sat on a bench, enjoying their treats. Charlie sat between them, occasionally stealing bites from both their ice creams, giggling when they pretended to be outraged. His laughter, though different from other children's, was pure joy given voice. A motorcycle rumbled past, and Charlie turned to his father with excitement. Greg had been teaching him about different types of bikes, sharing his passion in a way that transcended the need for words. Emma watched them discuss the motorcycle's details through signs, marveling at how their relationship had evolved. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they finished their ice creams. Charlie's hands moved in an elegant sequence of signs. "I love you both." Greg and Emma responded in unison, both signing and speaking the words, "We love you too." They stood together on the sidewalk, Charlie secure between them, their shadows merging into one. The streets around them buzzed with life, cars passing, people chatting, music playing, but in their shared moment, they found perfect harmony in their own unique silence. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.